Hello, welcome to the first episode of the fall season of the Public Health Insider. I'm Casey Farm. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations for the College of Public Health and Human Sciences at the Oregon State University Alumni Association. In tonight's episode of the Public Health Insider, we are diving into a better understanding of metabolic health, what it is and why it's important, and the small choices that can lead to significant positive outcomes. Tonight's featured panelists from the college are Matt Robinson and Sean Newsom. Matt is an assistant professor in kinesiology and has been with Oregon State since 2016. He received his PhD from Colorado State University in human bioenergetics, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship in the Division of Endocrinology, Diabetes, Metabolism, and Nutrition at the Mayo Clinic. Matt has led multiple projects investigating the benefits of acute exercise and longer-term training interventions on skeletal muscle physiology and mitochondrial metabolism. Sean is an associate professor in kinesiology and has been at OSU since 2015. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan in exercise physiology, and he did his postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Sean has completed several metabolic research investigations aimed at understanding the consequences of obesity and a sedentary lifestyle on skeletal muscle insulin sensitivity, as well as the metabolic benefit of acute exercise and/or dietary interventions. The question is, did you remember all of that? There's going to be a quiz a little bit later on. Our webcast is hosted by the OSU Alumni Association in collaboration with the OSU Foundation and the College of Public Health and Human Sciences. Following the panelists' presentation tonight, we'll have about 25 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. If you're new to the Public Health Insider webcast, I really appreciate that you're here. If you're one of our returners, welcome on back. If you look at the bottom of your screen right now, you will find a Q&A button, not the chat button, but a Q&A button. You are welcome to type questions throughout the talk and the presentation, and also during the live Q&A portion. And at the end of the presentation, our panelists will answer as many as they can before the end of tonight's episode. And based upon all the questions that I saw during the registration period, it looks like we're going to have a lot of questions. So if you have them, go ahead and use the Q&A function again at any point in time. And like I said, we'll get to them during the Q&A portion. All right, well, I think it's about time that we get this episode underway, because I know many of you are very excited about this topic, and I'm really excited to have Matt and Sean. If you guys want to turn on your cameras and your microphones, I'm really excited to have both of these gentlemen here from the college and the Department of Kinesiology. Gentlemen, at this point in time, the floor is yours. I'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you, Casey. All right, just waiting a minute for slides to pop up. Perfect, here we go. Well, I'm going to start as often. We're going to go back and forth. Matt and I will be handing the microphone, so to speak, a few times throughout this conversation. So on behalf of Matt, I just want to say thank you all very much for being here. You saw the title of our talk, Modifying Metabolism, Small Choices, Big Results. And normally the first thing that I do when we start a seminar or a lecture is try to remind folks why what we do is important. But quite frankly, I'm going to give a little peek behind the curtain, and apologies, you can yell at me later, Casey. But he told me this is the highest attendance they've ever had at a Public Health Insider event. And I doubt that that's because Matt and I have a cult following, but instead because metabolic health is important to all of us, right? This is relatable. So in that regard, I don't want to spend too much time belaboring stats or anything along those lines, but say, you're here because you care. And so hopefully we can shed some light on the things that we're doing here at Oregon State and make you care just a little bit more about what our lab is up to. So Matt, if you wouldn't mind with the first slide. I think the CDC really says this quite well and succinctly by saying obesity is common, serious, and costly. And you can take some time while you're looking at that slide to pick out your favorite or your least favorite statistic, quite frankly. The reality is, if we start at the top left, we've got about 1 in 3 adults struggle with the concept of obesity, having a bit too much weight on board. And the reality is it's over 40% of US adults actually struggle with obesity. If we couple in overweight and obesity, we're well over 70%. So this is an issue that affects the overwhelming majority of folks in the United States. It's particularly costly. You can see 147 billion in annual expenditures regarding our unfortunate and excessive weight gain. One of the key contributors on there, if you look in the middle right, is that only about 1 in 4 adults currently meet our physical activity guidelines. And so this information is relatable. Most of us struggle with a gain in weight as we age, and most of us become physically inactive as we age. That's not true of everyone, but the key point here is that these are common issues that we're all facing. And the reality is, it's not just weight gain and obesity that are the issue, but it's the secondary consequences that we know arise when we do gain too much weight, or we are not as physically active as we would like. And one of the chief issues that we deal with, particularly in our lab, is the path to type 2 diabetes, and specifically poor regulation of blood sugar. And we're going to talk in the next few minutes about why this is so important. Matt, if you wouldn't mind sharing the next slide. The reality is, one of the key pieces of information that teased for this talk is that nearly 100 million US adults have prediabetes. Not everyone knows that they have prediabetes, but these are folks that struggle with regulation of blood sugar, whether they know it or not. These are folks that are at increased risk for type 2 diabetes, as well as increased risk for a number of cardiovascular conditions. And so this is approaching a third of the US population. And unfortunately, this trend is projected to continue for the next several decades. So this is a major public health crisis, something that we are deeply invested in. And so the next thing we want to do is make this resonate. Why do we care about regulation of blood sugar? And that's the first time I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague, Matt. So Matt, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Sean. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight as we discuss the impact of metabolism and its public health considerations. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper right now into some of the underlying physiology. Sean did a great job of looking at some of the big picture epidemiology. But we want to address first the question of why do we care about weight gain and why would it impair aspects of blood sugar metabolism? So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the underlying physiology and pathophysiology of the development of diabetes. And in order to set that stage, we're going to introduce a common concept of fuel metabolism, and specifically how we all fill up gas tanks. Now, I'm going to use the analogy here and relate it back to how the development of weight gain impairs blood sugars, and it's really a central issue of fuel metabolism. So if we take our example of our cars, we recognize that as we drive a bit much, our gas tanks get a bit low, the fuel light comes on, and so we head on over to the gas pump, insert the nozzle, turn it on, and after a couple of minutes, it fills up and clicks off automatically. We don't really think too much about that automatic click off, but that is a fundamental piece. Why is that? Well, it helps the tank from getting overfilled. And this is a fundamental issue with the development of weight gain and ultimately the pathophysiology that we call diabetes. So if we think of it in terms of physiology, well, what's going on? Well, we have fuels. Also, they're in the forms of sugars and fats that we eat. And these circulate around our body, and they need to be transported into cells. There's a number of hormones that regulate this process. A main one is insulin, which stimulates the uptake of these fuels into cells, and they have to go through a transporter. So much like our gas tank requires that nozzle, we have specific transporters to get the fuels into our cells. Well, then they fill up a tank. And in our body, we have a few major tissues that could be a reservoir. We're going to be talking a lot about muscle, but we can also fill up our fat tissues as well. So the fuels get stored and then they get used. In our cars, they burn off at the engine, but in our bodies, they get burned off with physical activity, which we'll talk a lot about tonight. And if we get a little bit more detailed, where those nutrients are getting burned off within our cells are a specific component called the mitochondria. This is what converts our food energy into our usable chemical energy to do work. Now, just like our cars, our bodies have an exquisite fuel system that we can sense when those fuels are either full or when they're being depleted. So in the case of, for example, physical activity and exercise, we are generating byproducts of metabolism. Some of those byproducts signal to the muscle cells that there has been energy that's being used. So for example, some of the fuel sensors sense these byproducts. A major one that our lab and others are really focused in on is a fuel sensor that registers the accumulation of a metabolic byproduct called AMP. AMP is generated as our bodies use energy. And so the buildup of this molecule called AMP activates these other enzymes, which then signal our bodies forward that energy is being used. And they will usually have a feed forward system to then promote the action of insulin or promote the uptake of fuels into these cells. Now, what happens when we have too much of these fuels on board? Well, just like that fuel nozzle has a click off, our cells will also decrease the uptake of those fuels. And that is the fundamental issue that we term insulin resistance and the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes. It's a natural response to an over-nutrition and excess fuel to slow down the fuel uptake into the cells. So with that as the backdrop, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into why would we even care about skeletal muscle? What has muscle got to do with blood sugars? And we're going to introduce an idea that muscle is a main tissue that takes up glucose, our blood sugars. So we term it the glucose sink. Insulin is a hormone that is released in our bodies, and it drives the uptake of these fuels. And specifically, when we test the glucose uptake into different tissues, we find that muscle is the main tissue that takes up glucose. Nearly 80% of all the sugars after a meal are taken into muscle tissue, which is really quite remarkable. So it's a large tissue and it's very responsive to insulin. So what does that have to do with physiology? Well, after a meal, we see our blood sugars rise, and in response to that, we have insulin rising as well. And that helps to normalize our blood sugars and bring them back down. What happens in the context of this fuel metabolism issue? Well, in the context of type 2 diabetes, we see that there's a major decline in the ability of skeletal muscle to take up glucose. So it becomes less responsive to insulin. That's called insulin resistance. So what's the negative byproduct of this? Well, after a meal, we have a rise in blood sugars, and we also have a rise in insulin, but that muscle tissue is not as effective of taking up that glucose anymore. So what happens? Well, kind of like if we're driving up a steep hill in our car and the car starts to slow down, what do? You hit the gas a little bit more. And so our body releases more insulin. But remember, it's not as sensitive. And so there's not a response to clear that blood sugars, and we have an accumulation of blood sugars. So this is why we're so focused on skeletal muscle in the context of fuel metabolism. Now, much like the car analogy, we have multiple fuel systems. In essence, humans are an outstanding hybrid vehicle. We're using not just sugars, we're also using fats. And there's a growing body of evidence that is showing that fats are a major contributor to insulin resistance as well. How do we figure this out? Well, a few metabolic studies have shown that if we take a person who is lean and otherwise healthy, and then make them metabolically overweight, by raising their fatty acids, so the circulating fats in their blood, we can induce insulin resistance in this person. The contrary is the same too. An overweight or obese person, if we lower the fatty acids with them, so lower the circulating fats, that person then can become insulin sensitive. So this is some evidence showing that the high concentration of fats seem to be causal in driving insulin resistance, and they interplay with that glucose metabolism. Now, these are some small changes here. We can acutely regulate these aspects, but what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that over time, these small changes build up. So high blood sugars acutely doesn't seem to be that big of an issue, but over years and years and years, much like rust accumulates on the car, when it accumulates too much, then we have a big issue. And so the accumulation of these high blood sugars, high fats, high insulin can lead to a number of downstream health implications. We can have increased risk for hardening of the arteries. We can have increased risk for heart disease, aspects of cancer and cell growth. So this is why we are fundamentally concerned. We're not going to feel this on a daily basis, but we're going to see the long-lasting effects over years and years and years. And that's our fundamental concept. So it's a little bit of bad news right now, but we're going to start flipping over a little bit more into, well, what can we do about it? So Sean, I'll pass it back to you now.
Yeah, sounds great. So, and I think, that really helps to cement the idea that even though this isn't something that you can see, the excessive amounts of energy on board, they really do contribute to a lot of the pathophysiology we associate with poor aging, poor health, et cetera. So it's something we're concerned about, but we have a sunny side to this story as well. So Matt, if you wouldn't mind, the thing that I think most people in this metaphorical room are likely already knowledgeable about is that lifestyle modification is a fantastic tool to limit our progression to type 2 diabetes. So I'm going to briefly tell you about this landmark study that was done over 20 years ago by what's called the Diabetes Prevention Program. And what this group did is investigate the efficacy of preventing progression to type 2 diabetes in individuals who already had prediabetes. These are the folks at the highest risk. The overwhelming majority were overweight or obese. And they said, how can we intervene? And they tested 3 different conditions and followed these folks for years. The very first condition you can see in those dark gray bars is called the placebo condition. And this does not mean nothing. What they gave these folks is standard dietary and physical activity recommendation information, saying it'd be really great if you could reshape your diet and ideally lose some weight. And equally important is we want you to be physically active. So here's a pamphlet on how to do that. We'll see you later, and hopefully everything goes well. This is effectively the standard of care, right? And the next condition was metformin. So they did everything we just talked about in that placebo condition. They told people you should really work on your diet, try to lose some weight, try to be physically active. And in this case, we're also going to give you metformin, which is the classic pharmacological or drug treatment that is used to try to treat prediabetes and prevent progression to type 2 diabetes. And then in the last group, in those orange bars, the lifestyle condition, they went above and beyond the placebo condition, where they said, not only do we want you to lose weight, not only do we want you to be physically active, we're actually going to help you do it, right? So we know that these folks actually lost weight, actually became physically active. And what you can see across the board here is that lifestyle modification, actually losing weight, actually becoming physically active, was the best at lowering progression to type 2 diabetes. Because on our y-axis there, I can't really point for you, but we're looking at the number of individuals out of 100 that every year progressed from prediabetes to type 2 diabetes. So this is the information we already know. Lifestyle modification works. It actually beats our best drugs on the market. So weight loss, physical activity are fantastic. And I think folks already knew that. So I don't want to spend too much time in here. A brief point I just want to make is that whether you're male or female, the data was generally similar. And Matt, if you wouldn't mind on the next slide, race and ethnicity, it also didn't matter. Lifestyle modification works. And again, I think everyone already knows this, and this is the basis for the recommendations that we have. But the reality is, I think we can do better than that. So Matt, if you would, please. The next thing I want to convince you of is that even a single session of exercise can improve how responsive our body is to insulin. And this is a message that I think most folks don't get. Right? When we talk about lifestyle modification, people are talking about weight loss, people are talking about becoming aerobically fit, improving their cardiovascular health, and that is all fantastic for the folks who are capable of doing that. But I want to send a different message, or an additional message, if you will. And these data also go back to the 80s, right? You can see on the bottom right-hand side of the slide, this first study I'm going to tell you about was done in the late 80s. And what they did was take individuals who have type 2 diabetes, and they did a test that I won't bore you with, but they looked at how sensitive are these folks to insulin. And so these folks do not typically exercise. And this is what I would call their baseline level of insulin sensitivity, how responsive their body is to insulin. And if that improves, increases, we're going to consider that an improvement. And so they took these same folks and looked at how sensitive they were to insulin in a sedentary state, and then after a single session of exercise. And I'm not going to lie to you, they put these folks through the ringer. They made them do quite a bit of exercise. It was tough, but this is one bout of exercise. And you can see that they improved their insulin sensitivity about 3 to 4-fold, right? This is a significant improvement in metabolic health in one day. Now, be aware, of course, that these folks didn't lose weight. They didn't suddenly become fit. This is the result of changing that fuel metabolism that Matt was talking about, right? What did they do? They depleted the tank. And therefore, the next time that skeletal muscle saw glucose in the blood, we're a lot more responsive to insulin. And so this makes sense. But the reality is most folks aren't going to do the type of exercise that they used in this study. So this was a major focus of my doctoral study. So Matt, if you will, we did the exact same thing when I was a doctoral student, except said, let's ask folks to do a bout of exercise that's a little bit more reasonable. And so I'll tell you, I had folks that were on average about 50% body fat. These were folks that were significantly overweight. They did not regularly participate in any type of exercise activity. And I said, okay, let's look at your insulin sensitivity. Don't worry about the units, they're different. I just want to see what is the baseline that they came into the lab with. And then I asked them to do a single session of exercise. In this case, this was slow walking on a treadmill for about an hour. Okay, so this is the type of casual activity that just about everyone, not everyone, but most folks are capable of doing. And what did we actually see? And so the day after they did that single session of exercise, we could still measure about a 30% improvement in insulin sensitivity. And this is even after we fed these folks dinner, gave them a late night snack. Even the next day, we're looking at improvements in insulin sensitivity. Now, I hope you appreciate, again, they didn't lose weight. They didn't get fit. They were just active one time. And we can see an improvement in insulin action. So Matt, if you will. And if you're thinking, okay, well, I'm not going to go for a casual walk for an hour, I hear you. And so the message gets even better, which is we know we are battling an increasingly sedentary population. Most of our workplaces have us sitting in chairs. I'm trying to do my best, and I can see Matt is on the other side of the wall there too. We're both standing right now as we're giving this talk, believe it or not. And folks have tried to figure out what is the problem with just sitting down. If you're not going to go for a run, is there anything that you can do to improve your metabolic health? Perhaps if you're in the workplace, perhaps if you spend a lot of your workday sitting. And so there's a group out of Australia that's been fantastic tackling this very question. And they looked at how folks metabolize glucose when they have uninterrupted sitting for 5 hours. And so what you can see on the left-hand side of both of these figures I'm going to show you is what is their blood glucose response and blood insulin response to a mixed meal after sitting for 5 hours. And then what they did is take those exact same folks and break up that sitting time by having them do light walking 2 minutes out of every 30 minutes of that 5 hours. So 4 minutes out of every hour these folks were walking at a speed of about 2 miles per hour. And I can tell you, I walk faster than that to go get coffee in the morning. I'm a high energy individual, but the point is most folks can do this without much of an issue. This is running to the copier, going to get a glass of water, et cetera. And what was the effect of that? You can see that there was a robust improvement in their ability to handle that meal just because they broke up their sedentary time. Now, how does that compare with if they asked these folks to walk at a more brisk pace, walk at 3.5 to maybe even 4 miles per hour? Matt, if you will, not much more of an improvement. So the bottom line is it didn't take these folks much to break up that sedentary time and see an improvement in glucose metabolism. Again, they didn't get fit. No one's going to argue they got fit because they went to the copier, ran to the restroom, had a chat with a colleague, things along those lines, but they were getting out of the chair regularly. And this is important. So if we go to our key takeaway from what is largely the front end of this talk is nearly all physical activity confers metabolic benefit. We traditionally associate, I have to be fit, I have to lose weight. And if you can do those things, great. But even if you don't, any physical activity, we are proving more and more and more that confers metabolic benefit. And that's a key message I want everyone to take away. So with that, I'm going to transition to say, what are the types of things that we are doing now here at Oregon State that really piggyback on this message?
All right, thanks, Sean. So I'm going to walk through a couple of recent projects that our lab has completed. And I'm going to start with the fundamental concept of what is translational metabolism research? Well, we're starting with this fundamental axiom that the development of weight gain can have some negative health effects and that exercise is beneficial. So the inference out of that primary axiom is that if we can understand how physical activity and exercise are working, then we can do a better job of understanding perhaps new therapeutic options, provide some new targets in the future, and therefore help improve human health. Now, our laboratory does this through a number of ways. First off, we focus on performing human metabolic studies. Now, we also perform model system experiments using muscle cell cultures and also rodents, particularly mice. And the reason for using these model systems is we can perform studies and ask questions that may not be feasible in humans. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is use those experiments to then inform the human condition. We're trying to translate those results from the model systems back to humans. So I'm going to emphasize a couple of projects that we have completed in humans in the past couple of years. And this is through collaborations between Oregon State University and Samaritan Health Services through this new on-campus medical facility, the Samaritan Athletic Medicine Center. This is an outstanding new collaboration that really brings a lot of sophisticated techniques that is usually associated with academic medical hospitals to Oregon State University. So here we can perform things like controlled insulin infusions to test the response of a person to insulin. We can provide muscle samples, take blood samples and test each of these. We can perform controlled exercise and test responsiveness to metabolism here as well. So it's really been growing over the past couple of years. So I'm going to walk through a couple of projects that first started with a simple question: what's the regulation of muscle fuel metabolism with acute exercise? We recognize from what Sean was just explaining that we know it's beneficial, but how is it working? So this was led by a few of our former doctoral students, Harrison Steerwalt and Sarah Ehrlicher. And it was a fairly simple study design where we took people who are otherwise sedentary and healthy and then tested them on either a resting day or after a single bout of exercise. This was riding a bicycle at a moderate pace. We took muscle and blood samples and tested them before and after each of these sessions. And then we had a number of downstream outcomes. Specifically, we were looking at their insulin responsiveness and then looking at their fuel metabolism at the mitochondria and then some of their energetic signaling. So what did we find? Well, when we measured their insulin responsiveness, the way we do this is with a controlled insulin infusion, we found that after exercise, people had on average about a 10 to 12% increase in their responsiveness. Remember, these are otherwise sedentary, healthy individuals seeing an acute response to that exercise. So sure enough, we have an increase in insulin sensitivity. We then started digging down a little deeper into some of those fuel metabolism signals to say, did something change within the skeletal muscle? And a little bit to our surprise, we didn't see much within how the mitochondria are able to burn off fuels. There were some little changes, but overall, they were not as robust as the changes in insulin sensitivity. But what we did find very intriguing is when we looked at some of the cellular pathways related to those energetic signals, there was a large increase in a number of them, specifically the ones that are focusing on these increases in insulin action. So here we started to build a little bit of a story to show we have this increase in sensitivity, and it seems to be related to the activation of these fuel sensors. So our next question then is, well, what happens if we dive a little bit deeper and start doing short-term repeated bouts of exercise? So this was a project that was led with current doctoral students, Phil Batterson and Aaron McGowan. They're in their 4th years right now and really doing an outstanding job throughout these projects. And the overall question that we were trying to ask was, what happens with this active remodeling or these early phases of repeated exercise? We know that one session is good, but what happens when we repeat these? So we took sedentary and otherwise healthy individuals, and they performed 7 sessions of aerobic exercise, basically every other day. And then we studied them before and after, and looked at their responsiveness to a meal, and then tested also their muscle energetic systems as well. Now, when we tested their muscle or their response to the meal, we didn't see major changes. But when we took their muscle biopsy samples and tested their mitochondria for their fuel systems, we found a very intriguing result, and I'll introduce that here. In order to test this, we extract out the mitochondria from the muscle samples, and then we test how well those mitochondria can burn off a lipid. And so we have increasing concentrations of that lipid, and it tells us a bit of how well they can handle this fuel. And we compared that after exercise. And turns out that those mitochondria, after just 7 sessions of exercise, has an increased ability to burn off fats. Now, this was quite remarkable because the type of exercise that we were doing was relatively short. We were doing a series of interval training whereby people would exercise hard for about 1 minute, then rest for a minute and repeat that. So they did 10 bouts of these sessions on a single day. So 10 minutes of this higher exercise over 7 sessions. So a relatively short training intervention. And we saw an increase in these mitochondria. So then we started asking, well, if we have an increase in the mitochondrial lipid function, what happens then to some of the pathways that are driving those mitochondria? And what we're finding right now is that there's a major activation of several pathways that are related to how mitochondria use lipids. And so Phil is actively looking right now at a few genetic signatures to see what are some of the regulatory pathways. And we hope to have some new information very shortly on that. So those are a few of our current projects. And we're going to wrap it up now with what's in the horizon with what we're trying to work on.
Yeah, I'll spare everyone the details so that we have time for questions. But something we're really excited about is I led with this idea that a significant portion of our population is dealing with prediabetes, whether they know it or not, which is that impaired regulation of blood sugar. And while I initially presented this as a statistic, if you will, Matt, if you wouldn't mind changing over, this is really an opportunity, right? This is where we can intervene. We already have pharmacological treatments for type 2 diabetes that in many cases can be fairly effective. Yet we have very few interventions for individuals with prediabetes. And the long story short is we are actively trying to remedy this issue. We currently have a project funded by the National Institutes of Health where we are comparing a possible new treatment for prediabetes. And Matt, if you will. The overall objective of this study is to compare one of the drugs that we know is currently being used for the treatment of type 2 diabetes and see if that also works in folks who have prediabetes. And really exciting news in our lab is that we're finding a new mechanism of action for these drugs. And I'd be happy to talk about this if we have time in the Q&A period after. But for now, this is just an extension to show you the type of work that we're doing in the real world impact. So if you were to go to our website right now, this is peeled directly from our website, you'll see that we are actively seeking participants for a new clinical research study. And like I said, we're trying to test the efficacy of a new treatment for prediabetes. And we're using a lot of those tools that Matt talked about to see if we can measure an improvement in an individual's ability to regulate their blood sugar after 3 months of this treatment. So you can learn more about the project that we have ongoing now. We're actively recruiting folks who are between the ages of 30 and 55. I know that's somewhat limited, and we can talk about why. You can see some of the conditions that we're trying to exclude so that we have a little bit more narrow focus on this research project, but you can also follow the QR code or the website that we have listed there. And like I said, I'd be happy to talk more about that project. Matt, if you will. So I want to leave our section with some takeaways and action points. In brief, the first one is be active. Hopefully we've convinced you that if you can find ways to be physically active or limit your sedentary time, however you want to think about it, there is metabolic benefit, even if you can't see it, feel it, etc. And again, those are independent of weight loss and improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness. Those are still the gold standard, but any activity is good activity. And with that in mind, I want to focus on the next one, which is empower others. This is not a message that most folks know. The idea that even simply limiting your sedentary time, taking short bursts of light physical activity have metabolic benefit. We've shown it, right? The evidence is clear. So that's a message I hope that you carry forward to other folks. And then finally, this idea of, like I said, we'd be happy to talk more about it, but you can advocate for the type of work that we're doing here. We recognize that what we are doing in the College of Public Health and Human Sciences may not be well known in the community. And that's because we're not a traditional medical school, et cetera. But that's where Matt and I trained, and we're doing that type of research here. So if you want to learn more about it, you can visit our website, you can follow the QR code, et cetera, and we'd be happy to talk about those things. Matt, if you wouldn't go, yeah. So I just want to say thank you so much. We have a number of folks and a number of foundations and governmental agencies that really empower the work that we do. First and foremost with the National Institutes of Health, a number of local resources as well, many of which are tied to OHSU and Samaritan Health Services. And of course, we need to thank our own college, the College of Public Health and Human Sciences. And with that, last one is to say, we've got a lot of folks that we work with. Matt and I don't work in a silo. We have outstanding, talented doctoral students, both present and past. There's a number of undergraduates that work on the projects that we do, as well as we have fantastic partners at Samaritan Health Services and Samaritan Athletic Medicine Center. And with that, that's it for us, Casey, if you want to pop back in.
Fantastic, guys. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I'll give you guys just a quick break here to kind of gather your thoughts, maybe take a sip of water. For our audience members out there, we're just about to jump into the Q&A portion. A couple of things I've already seen in the Q&A section. There will be a recording of this exact presentation and the Q&A portion. So in case you came late or you want to watch it again, or you want to look at the slides as they kind of go through, we'll have this on the series website where you can watch it. It'll take us about a day or two to post it. We need to make sure that it's all edited, but in case you came late or you want to watch it again, or you want to share with people, we always love when you share with people. You can watch this exact episode of the Public Health Insider Series and every episode of the Public Health Insider Series on our series site. Gentlemen, the first thing that came to mind as I was kind of going through your presentation, talking about fats can drive insulin resistance. Is that the same for all different types of fats? Saturated, unsaturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, trans fats? I might have missed some out there, but is it the same for all of them, or are they different?
I was going to say, Matt, I hope you're okay with me taking first shot at this one. So Matt and I work very closely together, but we do have independent strengths that we utilize as a team. And so a lot of my background research that got me working with Matt is I do fat metabolism work. And so the first thing that I want to address is that idea of, we talked about the fats or lipids, same difference in our world, as a critical mediator of insulin resistance. And that is largely independent of the type of lipid. It is more so the idea that we have too much energy in the form of fat, right? And so we've done some work when I was a doctoral student, and some other labs have done a tremendous amount of work showing if there is too much fat available, it doesn't matter too much what the type of fat is, right? Now, of course, when we get into different specific examples of diets, does the type of fat matter as far as broader implications of health? Yeah, there's great evidence that saturated fats in particular can have some negative consequences. But as far as what we were talking about, the big picture concept is we really wanted to focus on the link between excess energy in the form of weight gain, obesity, and why does that drive insulin resistance? It's not critical that we're talking about any particular type of fat. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Matt.
That seems to be good. All right. Thanks, Sean. Let's talk a little bit about metabolism and aging. I got a big birthday coming up next year. I'm not going to say what it is on camera, no way, shape, or form. But does our metabolism? I know it's obviously changes as we're kids and going through puberty and coming into our 20s and 30s. But how does it change? Does it change as we get older, as we age? And are there any kind of markers or age ranges where you really need to be more aware of what your metabolism does at that point in time?
Yeah, it's a great question, especially as many of us can celebrate our 30th birthday several times over again, right? And what the aging question can be a bit of a challenge because there are many moving parts with it. We have the chronological age itself, just the advancing calendar years. We also have a number of other things that are going on with aging as well. Typically, it's associated with lower mobility, meaning lower physical activity. And as we've talked a little bit about today, that is itself a risk. Then a side product of that is, well, lower physical activity typically associated with small amounts of weight gain over time. Again, these at times can be very small that we don't even notice it maybe on a week-to-week basis, but over time build up to the point where we look back and say, I didn't recognize that all this was going on over these years. So we have accumulation of body mass that can have some negative consequences as well. I think the important consideration though with aging is a lot of these factors about small changes can have big results, can still apply. When we do studies in older adults with exercise responsiveness, for example, an older adult can respond very well to exercise to have metabolic benefits. So we never truly completely lose it. We still have the ability to respond, and that is a hope within it.
Yeah, I'll briefly add to that just for the time. I actually put a slide in, but we won't take the time to put it up now. And it's this classic example where we can look at how much insulin sensitivity someone has. And there's this group that has paired these data, and they don't tell you what the groups were. And all they say is, okay, these folks are lean and active and their insulin sensitivity is quite high. These folks are lean but inactive, and these folks are particularly overweight and inactive. And you can see the decrease in insulin sensitivity. And what they don't tell you is that the two different groups, the average age in the first group was about 35, and the average age in the next group was closer to around 65, 70. And you couldn't tell them apart, right? So the idea that physical activity is incredibly important, regardless of what your age is. The idea of gaining weight can be incredibly impactful in the unfortunate opposite direction, whether you're young or old, right? So it is, or older, I should say. So it's great what physical activity can do, provided folks can actually do it.
I know we're getting a lot of questions, we already received a lot of questions in the registration period, and we are right now in terms of weight loss. We're going to get to those here in just a second, but I want to stick with aging one more time. Can you talk a little bit about the metabolic, about your metabolic age, and how to use a BMR, what a BMR is related to your health?
Do you want to start, Matt?
Yeah. When we talk about the aging, we've got these two concepts that go on with it. I alluded to the idea of chronological age. This is just calendar years. And then there's also a metabolic aging. And this is what is related to more the changes in metabolism. So somebody can be accelerated or not. And our link between metabolism is a big one with skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is the largest tissue by mass, and it is a major determinant of our overall metabolic rate. So within that aging context as well, as we lose muscle mass over time, we're going to naturally have a lower metabolic rate. And we need to clarify, what is metabolic rate? This is just the number of calories that we're burning off per day. So there is some utility in understanding what a person's metabolic rate is so that we can have better prescriptions or recommendations around things like dietary intake and how exercise is modifying that.
Great, thanks, guys. Moving over kind of like to weight loss. Again, people have a lot of questions related to weight loss. One of the questions from the live Q&A that I like talks about, I see your studies look at aerobic exercise or walking, but if the skeletal muscle is so important, does weightlifting have similar positive impacts?
It's funny. I'll actually first defer to Matt because he's done a study addressing that question to a certain extent. So
yeah, yeah, it's a fantastic question, and what we have to remember is that when we're doing exercise, it requires energy. So whether we're lifting weights or doing aerobic exercise, so fundamentally both are an energetic stimulus, and also at the same time, both are usually a resistance stimulus as well. So as we're riding a bike, even though we're doing more endurance or aerobic training, we're still pushing against a resistance. So there's an overlap of aerobic signals and resistance signals in both types of training. Now, with that said, resistance training does a fantastic job of really driving our gains in muscle mass. And sure enough, that does increase our insulin responsiveness as well. So both types of exercise seem to be very beneficial at increasing this. And there's a lot of overlap in some of the underlying signals as to why that's actually happening.
Would you say that then, not just for those that maybe they want to go back and forth between the two, aerobic this day and resistance the next, other than just trying to avoid being too sore with any one set of muscles, is it also really beneficial for your metabolic health as well by going back and forth throughout the course of, let's say, a week?
Yes. So the bottom line would be, it would be very beneficial, but we'll have to add, it's important to define what we talk about when we talk about metabolism and metabolic health. Overall, when we use the term metabolism, it could mean a variety of things. Typically, what we mean is the burning off of calories. And when we talk about aerobic and resistance training, we usually incorporate both of them because, yes, they increase our caloric expenditure, which is good, but they also have independent, well, I should say related, but also distinct positive effects. So for example, a person who is undergoing weight training is typically going to gain a little bit more muscle mass, but there's also a coordination piece. So there's a neural component that helps the person as they are performing these resistance training. So as a person, for example, is in the aging situation, we like to incorporate both types of exercise, not just for an increase in energy expenditure, but because it helps to improve other aspects that also relate to metabolic health: coordination, person's ability to recruit their muscles, maybe balance considerations. So absolutely, we like to put them all together.
Yeah, and I would add to that the idea of, we're oftentimes talking about preservation of muscle mass, preservation of muscle function, particularly when we're talking about aging, right? Which I always like to say, aging, it beats the alternative, right? All of us are aging, just on different scales, depending upon how old or young we are, right? But that idea of preservation of function, activities of daily living, of course, that becomes incredibly important to Matt's point.
I'm going to kind of combine a couple of different questions that we had in the registration period that we're having right now, kind of all related to the idea of plateauing. So we have a lot of people who have exercised, multiple times a week, anywhere from like 3 to 6 to 12. That's what we're seeing. Effort to eat healthier, but they're really kind of plateauing on either on their weight loss or on what they're seeing as far as their own metabolic health, and even at times like their blood work is showing higher sugar levels than before. Just again, I know everybody is different. Like there are some things that are really universal, but everyone's a little different. So just really talking about in generic terms, the two of you aren't going to go into and be specialists and doctors and try to diagnose each individual person. But generically speaking, a lot of the things that we're seeing, intermittent fasting, there's all these different, I don't want to necessarily label them as fads, but they're different ways to diet and kind of go through. So overall, Matt and Sean, kind of talking about, again, plateauing, trying different things. What are you really seeing? What's the research seeing in metabolic health?
Yeah, I'll start, Matt, and please fill in any gaps, because that could be pretty broad. There's a lot in there, Casey, and I understand. So we were able to see some of these questions that you folks had typed in. So thank you very much for doing that. The first thing that I want to say is weight gain, weight loss are very complex, right? The idea of, we realize that we don't live in a vacuum. The idea that we are constantly inundated with opportunities to get too much nutrients, right? That is the world that a lot of us live in. Not everyone, but a lot of us. And therefore, there is more than just physiology playing a role in terms of our ability to gain, lose weight. And so I want to be clear that we appreciate the complexity of this issue. Not everyone has equal opportunities for nutrients, physical activity, et cetera. And so we are speaking in generalizations, to be clear. But to Casey's point is, each case, each person matters. It's an individual case. Right. So that being said, there were a number of folks who said they're physically active, but they struggle with weight loss. The idea that they're not losing weight. The first thing that I would say is, if you are not gaining weight, you are beating the majority of the population, right? That's the reality. Most of us are struggling with a few pounds of weight gain every year. It's not like most of us are gaining 20, 30 pounds a year and then it happens and we plateau. Most of us are struggling with weight gain as we age in small increments. So if you are able to lose any weight, if you are able to minimize weight gain, you are doing a fantastic service to yourself. Beyond that is physically active folks, right? A number of folks have said, I'm physically active, but I'm not losing weight. Hopefully a key takeaway that you have for this talk, and there's a lot of evidence to back this up, not just the few slides I showed you, is that there is overwhelming metabolic benefit for folks who are physically active, independent of their weight. Any physical activity is good activity at any weight, right? If we can get folks to lose weight, that's great, but any physical activity is good. And yeah, that's independent of weight loss. So that's something really important to keep in mind. And then the last thing that I'll just say is, because I know that it can be a little frustrating, to be frank, if you are being physically active, trying to lose weight, and you're not losing weight. The most important regulator of our weight loss, weight gain, is what we do on the fuel intake side, right? The classic example is, it is very easy for us to consume 1,000 calories, believe it or not, right? Depending upon the type of drink you order at Starbucks, you could do that as a snack. It's very challenging for the overwhelming majority of us to be physically active such that we expend or burn 1,000 kcal. So the tough part is really on the food consumption side. And that's something that is highly regulated. It's a challenge for all of us. So it does become a case-by-case basis, but most important from our end is any physical activity is good, regardless of the weight. Anything you want to add to that, Matt?
Yeah, there's for the folks who are seeing a plateau, there's a growing body of evidence right now that is trying to figure this out. And what we're finding in the exercise physiology realm is paying attention to the intensity of exercise. So if we think about what is a plateau, well, it's the body's natural response to a given stimulus. This is very common in as we teach here in the College in Kinesiology. As somebody goes through exercise training over several weeks or months, eventually that stimulus is not sufficient to induce the changes that they're looking for. So what needs to happen? Usually a change in intensity. And so a growing body of evidence right now is really looking at how an increase in intensity could help overcome some of those plateaus. So you may be hearing a lot of things in the news or the media of things like interval training or high intensity intervals or HIIT or sprint training, things like that. And that's really trying to get at this idea of, well, perhaps if we could increase the stress that we're put onto the system, can we have a beneficial response? And what's interestingly enough is that the stress signals seem to be going through those fuel sensors that we've been talking about. If we could push the system hard enough for a short bout of time, it can maybe activate these signals. So does that help with weight loss? Well, the bouts of exercise are still pretty small, so we're still not burning off that many calories. But what about other metabolic benefits? The gains in muscle mass, the increase in aerobic fitness. And if we even just kind of take away some of those concepts, can somebody get up and move a little bit more? Sometimes training goals are just simply, I'd like to maintain, as Sean has been alluding to. I want to play a bit more with my kids or my grandkids. And that's a functional goal that people are really shooting for.
Great, guys. I know we're coming close to the end, so let's do a couple of quick hitters, Sam, to take us on out. First, this one should be real quick. Asked, where is the SAM Center located?
Great question. So it is on the campus of Oregon State University. It's actually not too far from Reser Stadium, if you're familiar with it. So right on campus.
We had a viewer tonight ask about the glycemic index, and did it figure into the studies?
That's a great question. So that is not something that we have focused on particularly, but there's quite a bit of groups that have paid attention to that. Again, from my big picture perspective, the first and foremost is energy intake, right? How much food are folks getting? That's our first focus of attention. And then the second goes to the quality.
We also had a number of different questions around menopausal changes in metabolism. Anything that Sean, Matt, that you want to talk about that you haven't already highlighted related to menopausal changes and metabolism?
Well, I think fundamentally, it's a huge area of interest right now. So I think that we have more questions than answers right now, but I am very encouraged that it's an active area that people are looking at, and how to best modify and do some more individual medicine as we move forward. So I want to say, stay tuned. The next few years are really gonna take off.
I like that teaser. Before I get to some of your final thoughts, someone had asked about popular media reports saying that people who are overweight but active are metabolically healthier than previously thought. Is that true from studies that have been talked about over the last 10 years in popular media reports?
Yeah, in short, that's one of our key messages, right? People who are physically active at any weight tend to be metabolically healthier, not across the board, but in many cases compared with folks who are relatively lean or don't have as much weight, but sedentary. Right. And there's a great group that's been leading the charge with that. Stephen Blair, if folks are interested, he's got a great body of research, really narrowing down those points.
Lovely. Yeah, Matt, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Well, I really want to reinforce that the field is shifting a little bit away from terminology of exercise and exercise training, because that has a mental image around it, to physical activity. And remember, the things that Sean was really talking about, physical activity was getting up out of the chair and going to the copier, right? Walking a little bit more. And these are all things that we can do. So this is a big thing within the media that you see as well. More physical activity, yes, even in somebody who is overweight or otherwise metabolically unhealthy, certainly can have some nice benefits.
And I want to come back to each one of you. One last thing, give me 30 seconds about things that, again, takeaways you want people to come away from tonight's talk, things you want to summarize, and or things that you haven't been able to chance to add yet.
Do you want to start, Matt?
Sure. We'll come back to the title, right? Small changes can have some big results. And we've talked about it at some point within the negative context, but I want to leave with the positive context, that what you do today matters for the next hour, for the next day. And so if we can make that decision tomorrow and the next day, that's where we're going to change our overall trajectory.
Yeah, that's well said, Matt. And so, with a bit more time, we go into the details of the reality is the benefits of our physical activity are mostly short-lived. Right. So the positive of that is, if you were not active yesterday, who cares? Yesterday is gone. Be active today, because you're going to get those benefits for the next couple of days. And then guess what? You want to re-up again the next day, the next few days. So I'd say the chief message from us is, to any extent that you can, be physically active, because there are metabolic benefits, even if you cannot see them.
Sean, I like that we can put that on a coffee mug. Yesterday is gone. Who cares? Move on. So we're out of time. I know we had a lot of things to talk about, and I know we have plenty more, but this is the end of towards the end of the episode. I want to recognize and give a big shout out, Matt, Sean. Really appreciate your time today and the effort you put into the presentation and answering here for the end of the episode. and about all the questions that our awesome audience really has. So again, gentlemen, I really appreciate it. If you'd like to learn more about the college's work in the field of metabolic health and to learn more about the Translational Metabolism Research Laboratory, again, that website, health.oregonstate.edu/labs/TMRL. Again, you can watch this on the webcast here again in a couple of days. You can go back and find it. You can also search for TMRL on the Oregon State College's website. We have one more episode of the fall season of the Public Health Insider 3 weeks from tonight on Tuesday, November 15th at 5:30. So same time. For that episode, we take a little bit of a deeper dive on the lack of affordable and accessible childcare and how, thanks to a new $14.4 million grant, the college has established the Early Learning System Initiative to focus on providing childcare solutions that work for parents, help children thrive, and meet the diverse needs of Oregon's early educated workforce. You're not going to want to miss that. To register for that upcoming episode and to rewatch this one when it's up here in a couple of days, or any from the whole entire series of the Public Health Insider, you can visit our series site at fororegonstate.org/PHI. Lastly, I will say each of you will receive an email from me tomorrow that will include items for more ways for you to connect with Oregon State and take a brief survey about tonight's event. We would appreciate if you take a moment to fill that survey out so we can continue to bring you the programming like you saw tonight from these two gentlemen and that we have going forward with you with the Public Health Insider. So really appreciate that. Otherwise, have a really wonderful evening. I look forward to hosting each of you for our next episode again in 3 weeks from tonight on November 15th at 5:30. Go to the website there now and register. Otherwise, have a very safe and wonderful evening. Take care.